Hey everyone! Welcome back to the Book Nook. I'm glad you're here. Hey, check it out. I've turned this part of the Book Nook into our own special Neverland-inspired space. What do you think? Cool, huh? So, have you started to dive into the book like I have? I'm only one chapter in so far, and I'm already loving it. Remember when I picked Peter Pan for our book club? Jenna thought it was another fairy tale, and I can totally see why. It has magical elements like fairies and the start of an adventure. But together, we realized it's actually a fantasy story. Today, we're diving into what makes fairy tales and fantasy stories unique, using examples from Peter Pan. Let's investigate together. Before we jump in, let's think back to our book club pick. What about Peter Pan might have led Jenna to think it was a fairy tale? Take a second to pause here and write down some ideas. I can see where Jenna is coming from, can't you? Let's talk about it. Peter Pan does have some fairy tale traits, like magical elements and tricky villains. In fact, many fantasy writers get ideas from fairy tales and other traditional stories, using those familiar elements to build brand new, exciting worlds. But even though they have some similar elements, when we look closer, we can see why Peter Pan is actually a fantasy. Fairy tales are usually shorter, with simple plots and characters. They often teach clear lessons or morals, like being kind, brave, or clever, listening to your elders, or thinking before you act. You'll usually find them in familiar settings, castles, forests, or villages, with just a touch of enchantment or magic. Can you think of some familiar fairy tales? Stories like Cinderella, Snow White, The Three Little Pigs, and Goldilocks and the Three Bears are all great examples. Fantasies, on the other hand, build entire worlds with their own rules, creatures, and histories. These stories are often longer and more complex, inviting readers to get lost in a place that feels completely new. Have you ever read stories like Harry Potter, The Hobbit, or The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? These are all examples of fantasy, where the magic isn't just part of the setting, it's woven into the whole world. Now that we understand what sets these two similar genres apart, let's dive into Peter Pan and uncover some clues to see why it's a fantasy story. There are a few clues that show us this is a fantasy story. There are magical and whimsical elements, world building, and specific character traits and abilities. First, let's look at the magical and whimsical elements. Whimsical means something that is playful, fun, or full of imagination, almost like it came out of a dream. Remember, in fantasies, magic and whimsy are woven into the fabric of the world, which makes magic seem normal in every aspect of the story, even in something as simple as tucking children into bed. Take a look at this description from early in the story. One night, Mrs. Darling was tidying up her children's minds. All the bits and pieces they had collected during the day were gently sorted, with the naughtiness tucked away at the bottom and the loveliest thoughts brought to the top. A mom being able to look inside her children's heads and begin tidying up their minds? This definitely gives us a sense that this world has its own magical, whimsical rules, right? This connects to another element of fantasy stories, world building. In the story, it says, "One morning, Mrs. Darling found leaves scattered on the nursery floor. Leaves that didn't belong to any tree in London, or, it seemed, this world at all." How do these leaves hint we're reading a fantasy story? These leaves give us a big hint that Peter comes from somewhere beyond our world, a fantastical place, so unique that even its leaves are unlike anything we've seen before. This magical world is a key trait of fantasy stories. We'll probably get even more world-building clues about Neverland as we continue to read, uncovering more about its magical and mysterious nature. Fantasy stories also include characters with traits that only make sense in the fantasy world they're from. What might this look like? Let's take a look at the very first line of the book. All children grow up, except one. What does this simple line show us about Peter? How does this help us realize this is a fantasy book? Pause here to write down your thoughts. Peter Pan is unlike any child we know. He never grows up. That's something impossible in the real world, but it's possible as a character trait in this story. This unique rule about Peter's eternal childhood gives us another clue about the story's genre. And take a look at what Wendy says a little later in the chapter. Oh, Peter sometimes comes into the nursery at night. He sits on the foot of my bed and plays his pipes. I think he flies in through the window. Here's some more evidence that Peter isn't an ordinary boy. He has traits and abilities only possible in a fantasy story. Each of these clues, magical elements, world building, and Peter's ability to fly and never grow up, shows us that Peter Pan is a fantasy story. Well, I need a blurb for tomorrow's book club reminder, and it would be great to include why Peter Pan is such an incredible fantasy story. If you were writing it, what details would you include to show Peter Pan is a fantasy? Pause here to jot down your ideas. Here's what I came up with. Hey everyone! I'm so excited for tomorrow's book club meeting. We're continuing with Peter Pan, a magical fantasy story about a boy who never grows up. Soon we'll discover Neverland, with its own magical elements like flying children and eternal youth. I can't wait to hear what you think about this fantastical adventure. How does your blurb compare? Did you include details about the magical elements, the hints of world building like leaves from another place, or even Peter's eternal childhood? Maybe you even included some background knowledge you might have about this story. If so, great detective work. Those clues are exactly what make Peter Pan a fantasy story. Now it's your turn. As you read the next chapter in the story, be on the lookout for more clues that show that Peter Pan is a fantasy. Think about the magical elements, the way the story builds its world and hints towards Neverland, and the description of what kind of boy Peter is. I can't wait to hear what you discover. I'll see you here back next time at the Book Nook. Bye! Hey, hey.